Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. My name is Ellen Cools. I'm the editor of Canadian Biomass magazine. Thanks for joining us today. Today, Japan is the world's fastest growing market for wood pellets, chips, and palm kernel shells. Since the earthquake in 2011, Japan has implemented a feed-in tariff program and other favorable policies that have resulted in a large increase in biomass co-firing and construction of new dedicated biomass power plants. To provide some more information about the Japanese biomass power market, we've partnered with WPAC and FutureMetrics to present this webinar, generously sponsored by Player Design Inc. Over the next 40 to 45 minutes, FutureMetrics senior market intelligence expert and lead author Annette Bossler will be sharing some insights on this topic. During her presentation, please feel free to write in your questions under the Questions tab in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. I'll be monitoring the questions as they come in, and once Annette is done presenting, I'll ask her your questions along with any new ones that come up. But before Annette gets started, FutureMetrics President William Strauss is going to share some introductory remarks. So Bill, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief, just 1 minute to give a quick introduction to FutureMetrics for those of you who are unfamiliar. We are the leading global consultancy in the wood pellet sector. We've been in this business now for approximately 20 years, very concentrated in the wood pellet business for the last 10 or 12 years. Annette, next slide, please. And what you're seeing here is the core member of our team. There's Annette in the center, third from the left, myself at the left, and then we have our operations expert, a logistics specialist, a technology expert, and we also have Yoshi Kusano on the team providing us information on the Japanese markets. There are several other members of the team that are not shown here that work in our home office. Next slide, please, Annette. And then finally, just the last introductory slide. This is sort of a bunch of logos from companies that we've worked with over the past years. Near the top of the image are companies that we're actually working with now. So later on, when you review this presentation at your leisure, you can take a closer look to this list. And with that, I'll conclude my introduction of FutureMetrics and turn the presentation over to Annette. Annette, please proceed.
Okay. Good afternoon to anybody on the East Coast. Good morning to anybody on the West Coast, and good evening to anybody who might be connecting from Europe. My name is Annette Bossler, and I have a funny accent because I'm originally from Germany. So to prevent you from thinking the entire next slides, where the heck is she from? I'm originally from Germany, but Mid-Coast Maine here on the US East Coast is my home. So today we want to talk about the biomass power generation market in Japan, and obviously the demand for woody biomass fuels. But we want to put that in the context of the Japanese electricity market in total, because we believe it is very important to not just look at the biomass market segment, but the entire market, especially what's going on with the ongoing power market reform, and so that after this presentation you have a better understanding how biomass fits into the context of the overall market. I think it's fair to say that everything that is going on in the power market in Japan since 2011 is characterized and heavily shaped by the Great Eastern Japan earthquake on March 11, 2011, or what the Japanese call Higashi Nihon Daishinsai. So just like for Americans, 9/11 is a key date that marks a specific point in the situation of the United States. For Japan, 3/11, that is a key date that really had a seismic shift on the country. So if you meet, or when you meet with Japanese or talk to Japanese and they talk about Daishinsai or they talk about 3/11, this is what they're referring to. So more than 26,000 total loss of life, more than 130,000 people that had to be evacuated from either physically destroyed areas or obviously contaminated areas near the Fukushima nuclear power plant. As a result, all 54 nuclear power reactors were shut down in Japan, and there was for over a year mandatory power rationing for industry and private households, which you could see in everyday life, just like, for example, the subway, only part of the lights were switched on in any subway stations or in any train. So this is a key turning point also for the energy market in Japan. And a lot what has happened since then is based on March 11th, 2011. So I won't go through everything on this slide, but just point out some key general facts. So up to 2011, you have basically 10 Japanese utilities that control the market. They own generation, transmission, and distribution. They're very powerful. They actually have quite a handle on the government. Nuclear safety was a concern before. Every time the government sort of requested, let's look at the safety of our nuclear power stations, especially TEPCO's argument was like, well, if you do that, the lights go out in Tokyo. So it never happened. So with Daishinsei, this strong arming position basically falls apart, obviously for this reason, but also because utilities and especially TEPCO are financially now very vulnerable. And actually the government has to step in and provide various support here. So this basically then very quickly triggers that the government looks at the power generation mix, and obviously short term, because the nuclear power plants are shut down, the reserve plants are being fired up, and those are predominantly coal, oil, and LNG. Within a short period of time, Japan actually buys 50% of the world's LNG for their reserve power plants. And then renewables become suddenly an additional attractive option. So a year after Daishinsei, from July 2012, Japan introduced the then globally most attractive feed-in-tariffs for renewables, especially for solar PV. And therefore kicks off a real, renewable installation boom. You can see that at the end of 2019, Japan had more than 63 gigawatts of renewable energy installed and operating, 55.5 gigawatts of solar PV, because that is a technology-ready, widely accepted technology, and also Japan had an existing supply chain, so it was very easy to get going on that. Along with that, there's also in total, if you combine everything, all small plants, all coal-firing plants, you have about 4 gigawatt of biomass power generation and about 3.9 gigawatts of wind power generation. What should also be mentioned is that there is an offshore wind project pipeline of over 15 gigawatt, and that has some impact on biomass, as I will explain. The big issue in Japan is grid capacity and interconnection, especially in some regions of Japan. So Japan is introducing like a connect and manage system to better integrate intermittent power generation resources, and is also in July this year starting a capacity market. In terms of the grid and the utilities, so as I said, you have 10 regional utilities that are in the process of unbundling. So transmission and generation transmission will be unbundled. Having said that, it's not a very strict unbundling, so meaning the utilities can still own the subsidiaries that own the grid. So you can argue, how unbundled is this going to be, but this is an ongoing part of the power reform right now. You have in Eastern Japan, the grid run at 50 hertz, and in Western Japan at 60 hertz. That has something to do with the history of how these grids were built, but it's also the major reason why after the March 11th event, Western Japan could not easily shift power into Eastern Japan because only few interconnection points. So that was another point where the Japanese government or the utility realized they really have to look at the energy mix, but also at their grid as well. In terms of biomass power, if you look in eastern Japan, you have Tohoku Electric Power Company. That is a very important region with numerous biomass power plants. Then you have in Western Japan, Kyushu Electric Power Company, which is actually a big renewable hub. They have obviously lots of solar. They have some marine hydrokinetic energy and also biomass power. And there's an emerging another hub happening in the Chubu Electric Power Company area, especially around the Nagoya area. So if we look at the power generation mix between 2010 to 2019, you can see basically, yeah, the seismic shift in 2011, where basically nuclear drops to zero, and slowly but surely the renewables, which are basically officially around 3%, basically jump to over 10% by the end of 2019. If you combine that with hydropower, you can say that at the end of 2019, Japan had roughly 20% of power generation from renewable sources. You also see the spike, obviously, 2011, 2012 in combustible fossil fuels. That is the reserve plants, power plants that had to kick in after the nuclear power plants were shut down. But you can also see that the Japanese government is very, very eager to reduce that fossil fuel part, largely due to cost reasons. There's regularly a question being asked why Japan does not shut down all nuclear power plants and exits nuclear power similar like Germany did. There's a number of answers to that. Unlike Germany, which can pull in power from neighboring countries, Japan is an island nation. There's no grid connection to the mainland, so they somehow have to produce all electricity locally. The other major reason is these nuclear power plants are assets on the utilities balance sheets. You, as a government, tomorrow say, okay, we're going to phase out by year X. You are causing more financial strain on the already quite strained utilities. So what Japan is doing, and this sort of shows it quite nicely, is step by step, very quietly making changes and going in a different direction. You will not see a major shift. It's going step by step and very carefully. In terms of the market structure, the way it looks like once the power market reform is completed next year, there's a few important points. The most important player here in a way is METI, the Ministry of Economic, Trade and Industry. METI is, in a way, you can say the most influential government department. And in terms of energy, it basically sets the prices, the generation targets, sustainability requirements. It runs the show. Yeah. In addition, what's new, you have now, because of power market reform, 600 plus companies that are retailers in the power market. You didn't have them before. The 10 utilities had a monopoly. So these 600 plus companies are also free to buy their power. So you could have company X that goes to a biomass power plant and enters into a PPA, especially in the future when the FIT goes away. So that is a big change to before 2011. On the wholesale side, you have the trading companies, obviously, who are also wholesaling power, because a lot of companies like Marubeni and Sumitomo are basically active in multiple areas. They're active in terms of fuel trading, but they also own and operate power plants, and they do sell power. So it's a quite complex setup. I already hinted on the power grid. I won't go through all the details. You can read that later. But it basically shows again what the grid is, what it looks like, in that there is that, in a way, that big wall between the 50 and 60 hertz, 50 and 60 hertz transmission points. So there's only limited way to move power back and forth between Eastern and Western Japan. Because of the grid connection, which is tied especially in Tohoku and Kyushu, biomass power has to compete for grid capacity and interconnection with other generation, including other renewable generation. And personally, I think because there's a big offshore wind pipeline in the Tohoku area that is also looking for massive grid capacity, that can impacting biomass power plant projects, because if there's not enough grid capacity, then the utility is allowed to put out a tender for the grid connection, which adds additional cost. So let's look at the offtake prices and the process. As mentioned, so on July 1st, 2012, Japan introduced the feed-in-tariff system. And it started in a way, as you can see, in 2012, quite simple. That was one price for all, 42 yen. Whoa, my goodness, who had a project certified for 42 made a ton of money then. And over time, these prices are adjusted. Also, there are new categories introduced and other categories in terms of capacity, sizing, taken out. So you can say that in 2012, Japan jumped with both feet into the renewables, but not necessarily with having done their homework. For example, you could apply for any renewable project without submitting a business plan, without proving that you had site control, whether it's your biomass plant or your solar farm or your wind farm. Utilities did not do line studies. They would, give you a grid connection without confirming, can they actually handling what you're actually going to feed into the grid. So if you look at the feed-in tariff history for each generation source, including solar, you can not only see that the Japanese government is pushing the prices down, you also see that they're learning. They realize, okay, we have to give more money for this, capacity bracket and less for that. On the solar side, that meant that in 2017, they decided that for any new projects which were not already certified under the feed-in tariff for the respective year, they would go to tender. And the tenders so far have been undersubscribed because there's still enough projects in the pipeline of the developers. But you can say that overall by 2022, 23, the pipeline will be dried up. So any new solar or other renewable projects will either have to go through the tender or some other type of offtake mechanism or go into the capacity market. What is also noteworthy in Japan is they like to do add-ons. For example, they realized that in order to do a grid build out, they have to actually invest in the grid. How do you finance that? So they decided that starting 2022 or 23, they will add on a wheeling charge to existing projects, especially solar projects or biomass projects with high feed-in tariffs. So this is additional cost that can hit a power plant operator that may not be accounted for in the original balance sheet calculation. So for wind power is a similar story. So you're looking basically for offshore wind fixed at a tender. You still look for onshore wind. For offshore wind, you look at still some high power price, but that's going to move to tender. Similar for geothermal. And what you also see, they learned that, okay, it doesn't make sense to have one price across the board. Larger projects or projects that have new investment need to have a different fit than other projects. So it gets much more complex as they move along and they really get into this how to build a renewable energy sector while still keeping power prices or reducing power prices. Similar story in hydropower. And again, what you see on large projects, you are again in a range for existing projects below 20 yen. So you can basically right now say that if you look at the ceiling prices and also how the feed-in tariffs have developed, right now the Japanese government is basically saying, look, these renewables, they need to cost somewhere between, say, 12 and 20 yen, depending what it is. So that is sort of a price range that's important to remember. Okay, biomass power. What happened on biomass? So you have feed-in tariffs for small biomass power plants, and those have remained very high. The reason is quite simple. That is, these are small projects to revitalize rural areas, to also get the many, small forest owners in Japan to work together and harvest some of their forest assets and turn them into economic benefit. So that's why these prices, especially for forest thinnings, are still very, very high, and they're likely to remain that way because this is a successful approach. You also still have quite high power prices for power plants that use a combination of domestic forest thinnings as well as local sawmill residues. Now, those sawmill residues, they can be from our imported woods, but they need to be basically created locally in order to get the high fit. There is a very stable feed-in tariff for construction debris, and that's basically because especially residential housing in Japan is wood-based, so there's an ample supply of construction debris and wood waste, and so this very stable feed-in tariff of 30 yen per kilowatt hour is more waste management than energy. And then, yeah, you have basically the general feedstock, and so that's your larger, like 30, 40, 50 megawatt biomass power plants that since 2019 basically have to go through tender if they do not have a feed-in tariff certification. So the first tender, similar to solar, were also had issues. They were again undersubscribed because the project pipeline is still has a high number of projects that have a certified feed-in tariff. There was one case in the 2018 tender where the winning bidder decided, I'm not going for this because the upcoming capacity market starting this year is probably going to be more attractive than the 19.6 yen per kilowatt hour they would have gotten for the 35 megawatt co-firing capacity. The ceiling price is always undisclosed. So that meant also in the second tender, which also had IT problems, that meant that all the bids were higher than the undisclosed ceiling price. In addition, the projects were less than the 10 megawatt minimum requirement. So that was also not a very successful tender. In addition, in the first tender, the government allowed projects which used non-woody biomass for co-firing. In the second tender, those fuels were no longer allowed. So that you can tell that the government is still trying to find their way around it, how they really want to run this and what they want to admit as fuel and what they don't think is a good idea. What we also have seen in the biomass sector, similar to the solar center, a lot of projects got a FIT certification without showing business plan and site control. And so the Japanese government has been eager to reduce that bubble, which meant that biomass power facilities which had not ordered their equipment by March this year will lose or have now lost their feed-in tariff certification. And we estimate that that bubble of project is about 1.4 gigawatt of capacity. This is just looking at, for example, the FIT certified biomass power generation project versus what was actually then commissioned. And you can see you had basically, especially above 10 megawatt, you had a total of 6 gigawatts of certified biomass power project. But by the end of 2018, you had 585 megawatt actually commissioned. The difference is less at smaller projects, and again, that has something also to do because those are mostly small projects using local domestic Japanese biomass and have a different ownership structure. So domestic biomass in Japan, it plays a role again, especially with in the area of small biomass projects, but also in terms of co-firing. So you can see the wood thinnings, again, that's increasing, and that shows that high feed-in tariff really makes a difference. Japan has a very, very fragmented land ownership, including for forested land. And so you have basically over 87,000 forest management entities, and over 78,000 are basically small family land plots. So unless there's an incentive for these different families to work together and do something with the forest, it isn't happening. So that's why wood thinnings has a high feed-in tariff, and it's a successful program. Then you obviously have lumber mill residue. Construction dribblers, again, I think that is more waste management than not purely an energy aspect. You have some imported wood chips being used. For some reason, MAF, the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, Fishery, puts that in the analysis of domestic woody biomass for power generation. They put that in there, and I guess it's because these are wood chips that the generator buys from other Japanese companies. And then you have all types of other sources from different agricultural waste. On the imported biomass, we're basically looking at wood chips and wood pellets at PKS. Wood chips is an interesting topic. I mean, Japan has a very advanced and sizable paper industry, including high specialty paper and non-woven materials. I mean, non-wovens, think of face mask right now. I think the number for 2020 will go up because there's so much more demand. So what we tried to figure out how much wood chips are actually available theoretically for fuel use. So we looked at the total imports of hardwood and softwood chips. We have the data that's published every year by the Japanese paper industry, what they use. So out of the 12.1 million 2019, 7.5 million are used by the paper industry. We then looked at what other major sector in Japan uses wood chip, that is the particle and MDF board manufacturers. And the numbers that they published, we converted that's about 3.1 million. So that leaves about, for 2019, for example, 1.4 million metric tons of wood chips that are available for biomass fuel. And what the actual number is that's being used for fuel, we don't know, but we think it is probably close to 1 million or a bit more. PKS, palm kernel shells. They were first imported into Japan in 2009. Somebody discovered that, this was a waste product from palm oil production, but could be used as a fuel. And the demand has been going up. The major supplier is Indonesia. Prices have gone up for various reasons, including that Indonesia now leverages a tax per metric ton. I think last time I looked at it was $10 or more. PKS is not without controversy in Japan. There's a lot of pressure from environmental groups on the government, claiming that there are sustainability issues because not all PKS come from certified palm plantations. There was a government working group that issued recommendations in December 2019. The big question is whether or how strictly this will be implemented or not. Basically, yes, the government wants certification for PKS to be used for power generation, but there's a question about the type of certificate and especially the issuing entity of the certificate that is acceptable or not. And it remains to be seen what happens there. But PKS is definitely important biomass fuel for the sector in Japan. So the next one, wood pellets. Wood pellet import in a major scale started in 2012. So obviously with the biomass power feed-in tariff, Canada until last year was the major source. Vietnam last year overtook Canada as a major source. And there are a number of smaller players, Thailand, Australia, a little bit of Indonesia. And going forward, I think the US number will be very different because, you know, we know that there are some entities that have entered into supply agreements from the US to Japan. So the US number will look quite different in the future. In terms of pricing, this is data from the Japanese government. These are CIF prices per metric ton into Japan. And this basically gives you the main reason why, or one of the main reasons why why Vietnam is so important for Japan right now, because the average CIF cost is quite a bit lower. Plus, obviously, it's much closer to Japan. We think that Vietnam as a supplier is, it's not too far away from maybe being maxed out what they can ship. And there's also still some environmental group questioning how sustainable supply from Vietnam actually is. So watch this space. We do know that Métis plans wood pellet or woody biomass sustainability working group next. And this will be one country where they will probably look at the source in detail. So where does this go? What are the power plant players? We maintain a database of Japanese power plants, obviously 100% biomass fuel power plants, but also co-firing plants. Coal plants started co-firing because for the portion they co-fire, they could apply for the feed-in tariff. And especially there are quite a number of plants that use domestic woody biomass. So they get their 34, 40 yen, no, not 40 yen, but 34 yen per kilowatt hour if they use domestic biomass. So this is based on our database. We do know from looking at the monthly data that Métis publishes that there are 10 additional plants that have filed for feed-in-tariff certification just in time. But as far as we know, they have not yet implemented the fuel change. In terms of what we know, the fuel use being used for these co-firing plants, some power plants publish this on their websites, others don't. And often it just says general woody biomass, so that can be domestic, that can be imported. But what you see here again is the importance of PKS is plays a role. And yeah, general woody biomass and wood pellets making inroads with the Japanese coal plants. In terms of the pipeline going forward, so basically starting beginning of this year, there is those are the known plant fuel conversion that we know of which 3 plants are planning to use wood pellets. We have talked to some of the utilities. There is a strong interest in wood pellets, but one question that always comes up is the storage and logistic challenges for especially white pellets. So these guys are used to having their coal being piled up in the open air at some terminal. And as we all know, we can't do that with white pellets. You can do that with steam exploded pellets, but not with white pellets. So this logistics of handling pellets as for the co-firing portion, that is giving some of these utilities still some headache how to manage that. So if we look at the project pipeline of the 100% biomass fuel power plants, so you see this year is the year, and again that has something to do getting plants commissioned as soon as possible while they're still under the feed-in-tariff certification. What you see for 2021, 2022, and 2023 is basically the remaining project pipeline, and beyond that, any biomass power plants or most biomass power plants built then will have to go through either offtake tender process or capacity market, or see if they can enter into some corporate purchases agreement. Looking again at the fuel mix at 100% biomass power plants, which are 1 megawatt or more. So This includes a lot of the small biomass power plants. So you can see wood pellets, what's operating right now is more on the low side. It's dominated still by wood chips, PKS, and again other woody biomass. And again, that is being driven by the high feed-in tariff. When we looked at the wood chip plants, those are often affiliated with either paper manufacturers or board manufacturers who are obviously using some of their waste wood chips or low quality wood chips as well as waste wood in those power plants. If we look going forward, you can see that, yeah, wood pellets, the number of plants going to use wood pellets is going up. PKS, is a number of plants being planted that plan to use 100% PKS fuel. And again, woody biomass, again, mostly those are smaller plants. We do believe still, despite the sort of PKS sustainability guideline by the government, which looks like that it may not be as strictly enforced, we still believe that the 100% PKS fuel plants is not a long-term future for those, because the criticism regarding sustainability is not going to go away, and therefore woody biomass and PKS fuel combination, there could be continued growth because it gives the operators room to hedge and shift should the PKS supply or the worsen or be other issues. In terms of wood pellets, you get an idea. The ports where they come into Japan, again, the majority are in eastern Japan, in the Tohoku area, some in Kyushu, and then some in the Nagoya area. That little red square you see in the middle, that is actually Yokkaichi. Yokkaichi is a port which has basically a brand new biomass storage facility. And that is because there are some paper factories that are looking at diversifying fuel supply, and there's a number of projects that people are looking at. So that is probably the most or the best equipped port in Japan right now to be able to actually store wood pellets in a covered storage area close to port. Okay, then the big question everybody's asking, what's the demand outlook? We ran a number of scenarios, and those were based on our power plant database and how we see the market. So we believe wood chips are there to stay. That will continue to play a major role because of the other demand from the other industries. If we're on the conservative side and we look at the biomass power plant pipeline and some co-firing pipeline, we're projecting that by 2025 you could look at 9 million metric tons annually pellet supply into Japan. PKS, again, we are projecting it to go down. That is even, with the assumption that the sustainability requirements may not be as strictly enforced as it first looked like in December. But because that is still sort of a loose end topic, for right now we're sticking with our assumption here. Also, we always got to remember PKS is basically, there's only so much PKS as there is palm oil production. We know that palm oil production is currently impacted because of Corona. So consequently, there is going to be less PKS. That is a risk factor that also we think some of the power plant operators will be looking at. Our next scenario looked at, okay, what if the coal power plants really go gung-ho on co-firing? So we looked at our coal plants database and say, okay, if the majority of the plants that are technically capable to co-fire, if they co-fire 3% wood pellets, you could look at more than 13 million metric tons of wood pellets demand in Japan by 2025. Apart from feed-in tariffs, advantages there is a Japanese requirement, well, not strictly binding, but the Japanese government want the coal plants to increase efficiency. And one way to doing this is by switching to a co-firing portion. So that is also a scenario that is possible from our point of view. So obviously, a lot of the coal plants are quite old. So we said this scenario is probably the most realistic. So if we say, okay, if the old plants are really being phased out, but the remaining ones move to a 3% co-firing with pellets, you are still looking at over 5.7 million tons by 2025. Which takes us to the next big question. So what about cost? We see the trajectory of power prices is going down, and it's not going to go back up unless something totally unforeseen happens. So what does that mean? Can these lower PPA prices, whether they're FITs or tender prices, can they support the future growth of biomass power and therefore demand for wood pellets? The answer is, based on our analysis, this depends on levelized cost of electricity. So basically the delivered price of the pellet fuel plus the capital expense as total part of the total cost of generation. We have on FutureMetrics website the ability to pay dashboard that is free for you to use to run your own scenarios. For what we're showing you in the next slides, we assume the hypothetical supply chain costs as you see at the bottom of the slide. So basically, an average cost of $195 US to deliver to the power plant. So if we run this in our ability to pay software, assuming that we have 100% biomass fuel and we have a cost of $3,000 US per kilowatt of capacity, you can basically see that, you know, with up to 20 yen feed-in tariff, which is what most of these certified biomass power projects have right now, you can still make money. Once you get down to 19, which was one of the recent ceiling prices, it starts getting tight. So supply chain cost, you know, pellet prices have to be really well managed. If we assume it's $5,000 US capex per kilowatt of capacity, you see it's get even starting getting tight at the 21 yen per kilowatt hour offtake price. But you know, as long as you know the delivered cost is anywhere, yeah, between 165 and say, you know, $200, $205, it still looks okay-ish. It becomes a completely different story if you're looking at $8,000 capex per kilowatt capacities. Then even the existing feed-in tariffs no longer really work unless somebody finds a way to the secret sauce to really make the capex reduce the capex again, or find a way to bring in pellets at a really good price. So in summary, so the power market has been changing significantly compared to prior to 2011. And although the power market reform is now coming soon to its conclusion, I think there will be more changes happening either on cost for grid development or sustainability questions. So it's a market that you have to closely watch. Just like other countries, Japan is seeing impact from climate change. You know, similar to what in other parts of the world, they have heat waves, they have, you know, typhoon seasons that have been a lot worse, more extreme in other years. So, and they are signatory to the Paris Climate Accord, so they know they have to, they have to reduce their CO2 emissions. So, while the government on the one hand is committed to that, they obviously, Japan is an export nation. They will always run a policy that basically protects Japanese industry. So that fine line between climate change mitigation and protecting industry, it runs like a constant thread through everything they do. And that is why you will not see anything drastic. It will be all small step because they cannot afford to do something and then get it wrong. The impact would be catastrophic. So it's a small step approach. And you saw that, for example, in these year-on-year adjusted feed-in tariffs. The targets that Japan sets are on the conservative side. They're right now saying, yeah, by 2030, they want 22 to 24% renewables. They're already nearly there if you put hydropower in the mix. So biomass power has, the biomass power target is also getting close to reach. The question is, when they issue the updated energy strategy this summer, what will the renewable energy targets look like, including for biomass power? That's what we're all quite interested to see in the next few months. There is a market for biomass power because, again, these nuclear power plants, the majority will not go back online. The government is pushing utilities to use that infrastructure for at least the interconnection infrastructure for other generation sources, whether it's biomass power, solar, or wind power. And biomass power has a role to play. Personally, I think biomass power could be a great combination with what is in the offshore wind pipeline in Japan to basically off-balance an intermittent source. So pellet suppliers, I hope if you get a better idea now where the pricing is in Japan and what pellet needs to be delivered at in order to make this feasible in Japan. And I doubt that the downwards trajectory of the offtake price is going to change. So it is up to suppliers to also manage capacity and cost, and especially guarantee supply security. Japanese are very risk averse. If they feel like, ooh, you know what, we'll rather continue buying the oil from the Arabs because that might be better. They are very nervous about that the global demand of pellet might be going up. And because they're an island nation, they cannot, like most Europeans, plug into another grid and say, hey, send something over. They need to make sure they generate enough juice on their island. They will need to develop infrastructure logistics if they really want to grow the biomass power sector. It will be interesting to see if the government is pushing that. They did push investment on LNG facilities in Japan, as well as export facilities here in the United States. If they decide, and again, we might get an idea from the next biomass power energy strategy this summer. If they feel that biomass power is a sector that they want to grow, then I think we will see the investments in the respective, especially port facilities. So, and if that has created more appetite on all things Japanese, we recommend our Japanese Biomass Outlook report, which gives you a lot more information, a lot more data, and also our part of our plant database. And on that note, I'm conclude, and that gives us, I think, 10 more minutes for questions.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So just a reminder that attendees can write in their questions under the questions tab on the right-hand side of their screen. We have a lot of questions already, so I'll try to get to them all, but we may run out of time, and in that case, you can always email myself or Annette. So first, let's start with a question asking, is Japan's plan to curtail some of the fossil fuel generation to bring the number down to their target, or is the plan to co-fire with biomass to manage this?
It's basically both. Overall, especially with that coal plant, the strategy that they have is, to increase coal firing but also they have existing projects regarding carbon capture storage. They have some pilot projects in Japan. They also just announced a larger project in Indonesia. So that's a technology that they also want to use in order to reach their Paris climate goals.
Okay. We have another question asking why Japan has such lower rates for waste management feedstocks.
Yeah, because waste management is a big topic in Japan. Again, it's an island nation. It's a very densely populated country. They do not ship construction waste, for example, to other countries. So the idea is to try to dispose of it as much as possible domestically, and that's why the use or basically incineration of construction debris and waste debris is, as I said, it's as much a waste management measure as it is a power generation.
Right, okay. We have another question asking, are there any Japanese power plants that use different types of fuel oil as feedstock?
There are some power plants that use palm oil, but very, very few. And there is no growth in the palm oil fuel use, on the contrary. And the reason for that is, apart from the sustainability aspects, palm oil is used by other industry in Japan, notably the food industry and also cosmetic industry. And they also have quite influential voices with the government, and they have been successfully pushing the government to not heavily promote palm oil for fuel use, because they are concerned that the price will go up for use for the food and cosmetic industry.
Okay. So the next question, will the positive development with hydrogen infrastructure and usage have a positive impact on other renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and biomass to produce green hydrogen?
Based on what I know, yes and no. There's some regional efforts. There's hydrogen is a big topic in Fukushima prefecture. It's also something that the big car manufacturers, especially Toyota, are looking at. But how that, to be honest, I don't know. This is one sector, and then obviously there's the whole battery storage and aspect as well. What will be the biggest sector? To be honest, I don't know. So yeah, there is a role for that, but right now I don't see it as having such a big impact. But then I'm not a hydrogen expert.
Okay. We've got a couple of people asking, where do black pellets fit in the future for Japan?
Well, black pellets, if there was a supplier that had a large plant for black pellets running or soon running right now, they would probably find a lot of interest with utilities that want to switch their coal plants. Based on conversation we've had with different Japanese entities, they're very interested, because again, you could pile them outside like you can pile up coal. The problem right now is there's right now no plant that can basically commercially manufacture enough to supply that. I think if there is a company that is ready to go, they will find very open doors in Japan.
Okay. So we have a question asking if the Japanese authorities are planning to define criteria in terms of sustainability or CO2 savings like those of the new European RED II directive.
The answer to that question is we don't know yet. That working group that is going to look at that was supposed to start, I think, in April. With Corona, everything is also a bit, delayed in Japan. What we do know is that working group will look at sustainability, including greenhouse gas emission, accounting and how to deal with that. But what they're going to come up with, we don't know yet. We do know from some of the government documents that are out there that they do not believe that the way that the European account for greenhouse gas emission is necessarily applicable for Japan. So they probably will come up with something new, but what that is, what that will look like, we don't know yet. We have to see what this working group comes up with, which is probably, say, if they start the working group, well, we might see some proposal document end of this year, early 2021.
Okay. Next question, is Japan considering greater adoption of district energy and or use of biomass for building heat?
In a regional context, yes. There are so-called biomass towns in Japan. Those are, mostly municipalities in more rural areas of Japan where they're doing exactly that. And it's mostly where they're basically saying, looking at heat and power from biomass. But that is probably always going to be more like a rural area technology and less for the big cities.
Okay. So the next question, does the Japan power strategy have a specific target generation level for firm renewable power like biomass versus interruptible like solar or wind?
Yeah, there is something in the existing 2018 strategy which they have already met, because what Japan does, they always set targets that they can achieve. That's why we're really waiting for, probably I would say, normally it would be August. I don't know what the impact of Corona is, but probably by September we see the latest energy strategy, and that will give us a good idea if there is a revised and higher target for biomass power in that government document.
Okay. Another question, do agricultural pellets qualify for feed-in tariff in Japan?
Agricultural pellets from agricultural waste, I am assuming that is what is meant here. Under the old feed-in tariff, they might, depending what the feedstock is. Under the latest tenders, no. It's a good question. Again, if there's enough people in Japan that want to offer these, if they put pressure on METI might allow that category to be able to bid into the tender. But right now it's sort of a gray area.
Okay. Speaking of METI, what do you anticipate the METI requirements will be for sustainability for new biomass feedstock?
Good question. We assume it will be probably similar to some of the certification schemes that are out there, whether like SBP and similar. Again, the bigger question is if and what they're going to do with greenhouse gas emission accounting. Are they going? I doubt they'll go the Dutch route or the UK route, but what are they going to do? So the answer is I don't have the answer to that question right now.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we have time for one or two final questions. What are the bottlenecks to the Vietnamese supply of pellets to Japan?
It's the biomass available for pellets. Obviously, Vietnam has a large furniture industry, and so quite a bit of the wood waste from the furniture industry is being turned into pellets. And obviously, there's some other forest biomass, but there's obviously more revenue in finished furniture product. So there's not necessarily that much more capacity available for pellets.
Okay, final question. What are the primary competing consuming countries for wood pellets, and is the growth in demand there similar to that of Japan?
Well, the major competing markets right now obviously are in Europe. You know, UK for power generation and obviously other European countries for heat. South Korea will compete a little bit, but not necessarily that much because of the way their renewable energy targets are structured. The question is more like in Europe, if markets like Germany or others start looking at pellets more for power generation and not just predominantly for heat, then that could be a major competing market. But I don't see that on the horizon yet. Others may have a different view on that. So it's one of the discussion topics.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But as I said earlier, if we didn't manage to answer any attendees' questions, or if an attendee has an additional question, you can reach out to myself or Annette via email. A recording of this presentation will be sent to all registrants within the next 24 hours. So thanks again to Player Design Inc. for sponsoring this webinar, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.